Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Freedom Hub's uh, weekly webinar, Health Biz and Politics. We have a returning guest, Byron Schlomack, and he presented a long time ago on his great idea to essentially or effectively privatize licensing by allowing a state-based certification model to rise, which would be much better for both buyers and suppliers. And it would render licensing duplicative and it would dry on the vine. It was introduced as a bill a decade ago or so in Arizona when he was the economist for the Goldwater Institute, which is probably the premier think tank among the state policy network of state think tanks. And since then, Byron has moved on to the 1889 Institute, and he can tell us what he's doing now. But, among him, Murray Feldstein at Goldwater, Lee McGrath at Institute for Justice, and a few others. And we have Ed Timmons on now. Welcome, Ed, from West Virginia University, who's going to comment, sort of build on, or, I'm a former teacher. What do you call it? Extend the learning, some fancy pedagogical term from Byron's talk. And it's really important because anyone paying attention knows that doctors worth their salt are getting nailed by licensing boards for doing their job, which is prescribing treatments that work. And it's Orwellian and it's tragic, but hey, if that brings Byron's idea back into play, well, it's critical because we really can't have a quality supply and demand curve unless we get to competitive certification. Licensing is a joke. It's just another protectionist scheme like all the others. It's a cartel that really lowers standards. If you're a maverick doctor, you're going to get nailed by these state medical boards. Just ask any doctor, they're scared to death of them. So it's a completely useless smothering dynamic we have to get rid of. And the problem with the licensing debate is everyone is focused on the low-hanging fruit. I mean, God bless IJ. They get rid of the licensing requirements for hair braiders, but everyone's afraid to take on the big kahuna, Byron, doctors and lawyers.
Right.
But there's plenty of private certification and accreditation right now in healthcare. No one wants to get rid of that. They all think it's high quality. There's some problems with, endless requirements to re-up your certification and all these tests that the doctors complain about. But in a free market where these organizations would rise, higher and higher quality, kind of like the zero GMO project. You look for that on the product and the service, and you can't belong to it unless you follow the criteria. And if you violate the criteria, you're going to get nailed by the state AG. So that latter part is a problem for some folks. I tried to get a Virginia politician to introduce his bill, and as a real libertarian, he was a little concerned with that part, Byron. But we got to talk about this issue. If you're a free marketeer, if you want to really enable the quality that America offers us in potential, you have to discuss this issue. It is so important. It's a huge issue. No one knows enough about it. So, Byron, tell us about your journey with this issue, because it's got to get legs. And I'll let you share your screen too.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. The 1889 Institute has, just so everybody knows, recently closed down. There was an issue with funding, and so right now I'm actually looking for a job. But I actually started thinking about this idea when I was in graduate school. Read about licensing, became very much a believer that licensing is an unnecessary evil. But I started thinking, why years and years ago, it's now been a good 100 years, more than 100 years, that licensing has dominated in the United States. Why didn't the people who were pushing, and I think a lot of them did it for honest reasons, pushing for qualitative controls over certain occupations, mainly medicine. Why didn't they think of a private certification idea? And I think the main reason is that they couldn't imagine a way to defend a credential that they might have created without very high cost and without it being really an unreliable way of enforcing their credential. And because what they would have had to do is sue someone. They'd had to go into the civil litigation. And even if you win a lawsuit, which there's uncertainty and there are high costs associated with that, how do you ever collect? And so it just looked to me like the thing to do was to create a system where private certifiers could be protected by fraud law, anti-fraud. And because it is fraud. If you claim a certification or claim a credential that you don't have, that's fraud. And so I'm hoping this comes up the correct way when I share my screen. There. Is this sharing right?
Yep.
All right. So the idea is to create this fertile environment for competing private organizations to certify practitioners. And when I wrote this wasn't just aimed at medicine and still isn't. Then allow people to compete who are certified by these private organizations to compete in the same space as the currently licensed. The problem is, in the past, our main focus has been to repeal licensing laws. It hasn't worked. Every time we repeal a licensing law of some sort, 2 or 3 more licenses are created in the same state, maybe even during the same legislative session. And oftentimes our people on our side in the movement don't even know that that's happening. It flies totally under their radar. So that didn't seem like a very good strategy. Right now, something that's going around the country, and it's real popular among think tanks, Alex, the model bill for it is this universal recognition of licensing that passed in Arizona, where basically if they license somebody in Arizona and you come in from a state with a similar license, you're automatically recognized as your credential is recognized as valid in Arizona. Sounds real good. In a lot of ways it is. And in the short run, I think it is a good thing. But in the long run, I'm very concerned that all this does is ultimately create a nationwide sort of licensing regime where everything is even more in licensing is even more cemented in place. My ultimate goal with this private certification idea is that it would create an incentive to eventually just do away with licensing because it wouldn't be necessary or wouldn't be felt necessary and would be ineffective. So how do you do this? Well, the first thing you do is, let's see. Lee McGrath helped me with this draft in its current form. It's available. The 1889 Institute website still exists. So www.1889institute.org. You can also find, if you look, sorry, let me back up. This short paper that I wrote for, co-published with the Goldwater Institute is available on the Goldwater Institute's website. All the text of the model bill is in that paper. It's just that it's annotated. It's described section by section. But under the model bills on the 1889 Institute website, which you can go to at the top banner, there's a model bills button. The private certification idea is available there. And also you can email me, and my current email is on each of these slides, and I'll send it to you. Lee had the idea of calling it the 21st Century Consumer Protection and Private Certification Act. The bill that was introduced in Arizona was based on a draft that I did by myself, and being a little bit of so it looked a little bit different, but it had the same basic theme. But the key section in that draft is section 5, and it's only one sentence. And it's simply that if you claim to have a certification under this model bill, you're guilty of fraud if you don't actually have the certification, and you can be prosecuted under the state's fraud laws. But the thing is, you don't want just anybody being able to claim this kind of fraud protection. And so what this sets up are criteria, mainly having to do with transparency for consumers, that to determine whether or not an organization is worthy of this kind of protection. And basically, you can see here on this list, you have to state what your scope of practice is. It's got to be up on the web. It's and readily available to individuals. Practitioners have to make information available to individuals. Practitioners have to post a sign that they're not regulated by the government. As a certifying organization, you have to be highly transparent about everybody that you've certified, what qualifications they have, what training you require, and in what other states the organization is registered. It's going to have to register with a state official in order to get this fraud protection. They obviously, law enforcement needs to know that this organization exists. And the way it's drafted right now, it contemplates that an organization would be national in scope, not just limited to that one single state. But the idea here is that multiple certifying organizations could exist parallel to each other and have very similar scope of practices and compete with each other on their training and the quality of the people that they certify. The other key factor, to this is the ability of privately certified individuals under this umbrella to compete directly with those who are already licensed, that is, in the same scope of practice space. What this does is make it possible for markets to determine who should be credentialed, who shouldn't be credentialed, who really needs to be credentialed, what kind of credential they should have. When I was in Arizona, I remember there was a fight between acupuncturists and physical therapists. Physical therapists had started this type of therapy that my understanding, it was ultimately unsuccessful, but they called it dry needling, and it was awfully close to acupuncture. And the acupuncturists were up at arms, and they obviously wanted the legislature to adjudicate this difference between the two licensing organizations and determine who gets that scope of practice space. This would be determined by the market purely. There would be no need for someone to go to the legislature. And so, for example, many licenses in the healthcare realm are made necessary because the original medical licenses for medical doctors was so broad that if you practice any kind of healing art, you're going to get subjected to persecution by the medical licensing authorities. Well, that's a major reason chiropractors are licensed. It's a major reason naturopaths are licensed. It's just about anybody in the healthcare space has to be licensed just to protect themselves from being convicted for practicing medicine without a license. This makes it possible if they form an association. This law is the law in a particular state. They form an association. They do all the right things according to this bill, which are pretty minimal when you get right down to it. They're not just protected, not only is their certification, their credential protected through the fraud laws, they are protected from prosecution by licensing agencies. And so that's a key feature to make this a true alternative to medical licensing, to licensure as we know it today. Now, I have to figure out how not to share my screen. Nothing's coming up at the moment. Allow me to change anything.
You can see stop share. There you go.
Okay. So any questions, comments? I'm open. As I said earlier, Lee McGrath helped me with this draft. One of the things that happens when I talk about this to free market oriented individuals, especially legislators, is the first thing they ask is, well, how do you exempt medicine and law from this proposal? And of course, it's not designed for those things to be exempted. In fact, it's designed for those things to be included. And you know, generally I'm speechless. It's not drafted in any way to exclude those two areas. The other thing is it doesn't do anything to interfere with the regulation of substances. So look, right now, if you want to prescribe pharmaceuticals, that's all completely ensconced in the licensing laws. And it's going to stay that way until something like this exists for a while and you start getting people to pressure the government to do something different. And so again, this is about starting somewhere and hopefully leading to a better result.
Thanks, Byron. Professor Timmons, do you want to comment and give your ideas?
Sure. Well, thank you for the invitation, Charles, and thank you, Byron, for that presentation. I think you're absolutely right that history has told us that trying to de-license professions generally is a non-starter, and I think there's definitely some merit to thinking about reframing this as adding some level of competition with respect to licensing boards. And if we think about how physician licensure has worked historically, you have every physician subject to exactly the same boilerplate set of requirements. And given how the marketplace has evolved and the advent of specialization, you have everything ranging from pediatrics and primary care all the way up to brain surgery and more advanced surgery. I don't necessarily think that a one-size-fits-all approach in any way is the most efficient way of going about making sure that providers are adequately trained. And if we think about how the United States stacks up to other European countries, there are a number of other European countries that have 6-year paths for licensing as opposed to the 8-year path that we have in the United States. It's not at all clear that requiring physicians to complete a traditional 4-year education and then moving on to 4 years of medical school is adequately or properly preparing physicians and making sure that patients are receiving the highest quality of care. And, I think it goes to be said, Charles mentioned at the outset, that there already are so many other private entities that are required to make sure that licensing functions as it should, because as the state goes, or as the state would say, anybody who's licensed as a physician could do brain surgery. I mean, if I'm licensed as a pediatrician, at least as far as the state's concerned, I would have the ability to do any sort of medicine. We need all of these additional layers of private certification, whether that be operating room privileges, whether that be board certification. Without those additional layers, the market would not function with licensing alone. And I should point out that there have been some related bills that have been put forth. That there's a model piece of legislation, the Occupational Licensing Consumer Choice Act. It hasn't really, it's not quite the same thing as Byron's proposal. This would essentially make licensing become certification. And perhaps from a legislator's standpoint, that might be more frightening. Perhaps having this idea of a competing, leaving the licensing as it is, but having a competing private certification where individuals were able to practice does, I think, make a lot of sense.
I want to reinforce what you were saying about the fact that doctors are licensed. They, as far as the state is concerned, they can do anything. And it's private certification that determines that someone can do brain surgery. And the hospitals and the insurance companies have something to say about that as well. And
can I clarify?
So all this already exists in medicine. I apologize. Yes, sir.
Could I clarify something? As a practicing physician, I'm licensed to do brain surgery. I'm licensed to do that. Now, the question is whether I could get privileges to do it in a hospital. Naturally, you'd have to have hospital privileges to do that. So there are several steps other than licensure. There is, gaining privileges. If I opened my own hospital, I could do brain surgery. Now, that's one of the reasons why this certificate of need, which you've discussed previously, is out there. So yeah, there are steps in that. I might say I'm a little concerned about having a national certification, mainly because every time something gets nationalized, it gets federalized, it gets taken over by government. One of the examples of that is this current compact. I'm sure you're all aware of the Federation of State Medical Boards. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a private outfit, a non-government entity that got state medical boards together and to make sure that licensure was going to be uniform. And they got, the specialty boards to go along with them at hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars by the CEOs of the American Board of Medical Specialties to go along to create, maintenance of licensure, maintenance of certification, which has been roundly criticized. But now we have this compact of states that's getting together. Ohio passed it. And this compact is, I think, now 35 states. And this is supposedly to make it easier to license in other states. And I think what you're suggesting is certification would be a step around that. Frankly, the Federation of State Medical Boards ought to be done away with. States ought to pull away from it. And we need to do away with the Ohio State Medical Board, which has become nothing but a political tool of the federal government.
David, before you respond, Byron, and Ed too, if the nationalization of a private certification dynamic concerns you because of the possible takeover by the government, if it was more limited to the 50 states in a more competitive dynamic, would you be less opposed to it, or would you be open to that?
No, I'd be open to that. There really is a medical licensure. You know, we've got licensure and certification, but there is a certification for your specialty, which is out there now. And there is AAPS has been involved, and there is a private group now that is certifying specialists in their various specialties, as apart from the American Board of Medical Specialties, American Board of Internal Medicine, Surgery, that sort of thing. And as far as I know, that is getting some traction. I'm not sure, you know, how popular it is right now, but I can tell you it's taken the steam out of this maintenance of licensure, that kind of thing. Let me just say one other thing. You know, to get a medical license every 2 years costs now about $700. Now, this compact, I just got a survey from the state of Ohio to see what I thought of the compact, which I was very much against. But guess what? That's another $700 to be a member of the compact.
So David, given what Professor Schlomack and Tim has commented on, could you envision this proposal upping the quality of medicine, in that you would belong to whichever private certification or organization that you wanted to belong to, and consumers would seek out your brand for the top quality doctor?
Absolutely.
And no one could join it if they don't meet the criteria. Does that vision work with your vision?
Yes, more and more it appears that licensure becomes a political tool. Has nothing to do with quality. You know, my philosophy is the patient chooses the quality, the physician chooses the quality. We know who good doctors are. We know doctors who, you know, we think maybe are not quite as good. So the patient and the doctor working together, I still get consults about twice a week about who to call for a family doctor or whatever. So I think there's no question that licensure does not guarantee quality.
They get
That's
that Westbrook.
a private market decision made by individuals.
Ed and Byron, we want to comment on that?
The first thing I would say is, as far as the national sort of scope goes, that's only a possibility. It doesn't. There's nothing in the draft to say that it has to be a nationalized organization.
And Byron, sorry to interrupt, but your bill is a state law bill. It's not a federal bill, correct?
Yes, and the thing to keep in mind with these compact issue, the compact issue is that it's in the context of every state licensing medicine. It's in the context of every state having a licensing agency. And so they can organize the way they've organized specifically because of that. The main reason for making it possible for an organization that's not just limited to a state to certify someone in a state and have that person protected by this law is that everything has to start somewhere. You can't immediately think that you're going to have enough people in a state like New Hampshire or even Montana or one of these smaller populated states, that you're going to have enough people to get the kind of critical mass that you need for something like this to work. And so that was more about making an effort to make sure that there's some level of critical mass out there that could avail itself of this law. The other issue is, look, licensing agencies don't guarantee quality. They often let their practitioners get away with things. They're as much a protection racket as they are about enforcing particular quality standards. And so the idea behind this is that certifying organizations would, I believe they really truly would, compete with each other on the basis of how well they police their members and how well they enforce their quality standards.
Ed, do you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I do also share concerns about compacts, and I think some of the discussion around licensing reform, and I think this comes back to Byron's point regarding universal recognition. I think too often the discussion gets focused on the mobility question, which certainly is a concern when it comes to licensing. But I think some of the time, the central issue regarding licensing, the arbitrary barriers that are imposed, and oftentimes the inefficiency regarding those licensing standards gets lost. So, I mean, I think compacts are something that we should be concerned about. I think universal recognition is better. I certainly understand that there are some concerns, but some of the newer legislation that's coming out has provisions for unlicensed individuals, which I think at the very least gets the conversation started as to why the licensing exists in that state in the first place.
All right, Kim, you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. I have worked in this field. I've lobbied for 25 years. So I would like to comment on a few things. First off, the American Medical Association and the American Medical Association of Pharmacists started in the 1800s. At that time, all different kinds of medicines were legal. And what they did is that they organized themselves, and it was a certifying body, right? Just like you're creating now. What they did is they organized themselves into a certifying body, and then they went to the government and said, we want licensure and nobody else can practice. At that time, they put osteopaths, they made osteopathy illegal. They made homeopathy illegal. They made chiropractic illegal. And so these professions actually had to come in and fight for the legalization of their practices once again. And that was in the late 1800s. And by about 1913, 1918, most of the medical practices acts were in place by the very kind of association that this would create. Now, in 1999, 2000, I started lobbying for what is called exemption laws. Safe harbor laws. At this point, we have exemption safe harbor laws in 11 states, and doctors can do this as well. And this actually does keep it up open in the free market. And then if you just allow the free market to decide, people know who are good doctors and who aren't. People know who are good practitioners and who aren't. And the other thing too, in these safe harbor bills, there's 11 states. They're in Maine, Nevada, Colorado. I helped pass that one here. In New Mexico, I helped enact that one. Arizona has a free harbor act, Louisiana, Rhode Island, California, Minnesota, Oklahoma, Idaho. These aren't small states. Most of these laws have been around since 2009, 2008, 2013, where alternative practitioners can practice legally as long as they don't do certain acts, right? Now, and I'm going to get to how physicians can protect themselves too. So as long as we put out on and we don't have to be a part of any association. It's our business. It's my business between myself and this other person that I'm working with. So we have to put what our education is. We have to put the theory behind our practices. The client has to sign off saying that they know what the theory is and they know that we are not licensed in any way, shape, or form. And then if they have a complaint, then they can go and they can press civil charges, because there are many, many consumer acts out there. Now, how do doctors get around the licensing laws, which really under the AMA, you guys created for yourselves, right? You backed yourselves into a corner by doing this, because, and this bill that you're trying to put forward, Byron, it actually negates all the laws I'm talking about. And it makes alternative practices illegal in all of these 11 states that I, for 25 years, have lobbied to make it open to everyone. So everyone's, yeah, because, you know, there's one line in there in the first one with the definitions that you say that any occupation, if you go in there and if you look at the first couple paragraphs in your definition, you say any occupation, that puts alternative practitioners underneath this credentialing underneath the certification thing.
But it
And I
doesn't
do,
repeal any of the laws that you're talking about.
it doesn't,
repeal-
it doesn't repeal it, but it does put us underneath, because it says any occupational field. It puts us underneath your certification. It would
It
negate our health
potentially
freedom.
does if you created a
Yes.
certifying organization.
Yeah, and so, but somebody's going to do that. I don't want that. There are many of us that don't want that, but somebody's going to see that, wow, we can monopolize this certifying organization, and we can control this entire CAM field in Oklahoma
They
or
can't stop
Colorado.
other people from coming in with another certifying organization. And they can't,
But
and
yeah,
your law isn't
so
repealed, and it
so
doesn't
my
keep
point is,
people from
my point
practicing
is
under
this.
that.
My point is this: I am an alternative practitioner. I represent over 100,000 other practitioners in Colorado. We do not want certifying boards. Other people will come in and create certifying boards for us and make us follow that rule because of how this is written. We don't want that. The free market will tell us whether or not we're a good practitioner or not. If we're not a good practitioner, we'll
agree
go
with
out of
that.
business. Yeah,
I don't
if
have
we're
any
not a practitioner.
objection. I don't have
Yeah.
any objection to what you've put forth and what's been passed in those states. I don't think it creates a fertile environment. I mean, you said you were going to get to physicians and all. I'm not
Yes,
sure that it
and there's-
creates a fertile environment for beating back licensing as it exists.
Yes. Well, but there's a way for physicians to go in, and I thought a lot about this over the last year, because we need both. We need both alternative health, and we need both physicians. I am not a purist about CAM, right? And I realize that the generations of physicians coming after the original AMA certification, association, that's actually what they did. How you're setting this up is what they
Again,
did. They just took it.
this is different in that
It was
other
but in the
organizations
beginning,
can
yeah.
prevail themselves of fraud laws,
Yeah,
whereas
but
that didn't exist in the 1800s, and nobody was talking about it.
well, no, in the 1800s, it didn't exist until the American Medical Association was the original and first certifying medical body. It was a certifying association. It was not a licensing.
Which
Licensing
didn't
came
enjoy
next.
anti-fraud law.
Yeah. So, and I'm talking about, I'm talking about the way that physicians can go about doing this. They can, in Colorado, it was illegal for physicians to practice alternative medicine. And in 1999, Senator Ron Stupa, I think that was his name, he passed an exemption for all medical doctors, that if you practiced alternative health as a medical doctor, you would not get your medical license revoked. And so then all of a sudden, medical doctors were practicing alternative health in Colorado, and it was great, right? And then another thing that doctors could do is, under the Health Freedom Act, originally licensing laws were only supposed to be used if the person was going to die from the malady they had, or if the treatment for the malady they had was going to kill them and it was a dangerous treatment. Everything else was supposed to be in the public domain, but that got changed over time. And then all of a sudden it became standards. Well, the free market will choose those standards for people. People will go out of business. But here's where we can go with the physicians, right? If the physicians come in, they pass 3 small paragraphs within their licensing bills. They say that all doctors in this state are exempt, and they can use alternative health practices. Boom, that broadens their scope, but it doesn't put anyone else out of business, and it doesn't create yet another set of hoops and ladders for everyone to go through, right? There helps your quality of standards right there. So the second thing that they can do is they can create a second exemption that says that anyone who practices surgery or prescribes legend drugs, right, may set up their own private membership association through their private practice. And now, Mr. Westbrook, you were talking about doing brain surgery and not being allowed to go into a hospital and do that, right? If you create a private membership association within each doctor's practice, that doctor, he is going to be able to be criminally charged, and then have another paragraph that states that that doctor has to have a certain bond, a bond limit, and that's not malpractice insurance, that's a bond, right? So a bond limit. So if anything happens, then that person can, negotiate under that private membership contract with that doctor's office, right? You state that you as a member cannot sue me for anything but gross negligence, right? And that protects doctors as well. So back to Dr. Westbrook, what you said about hospitals not letting you come in. There are many, many clinics that are opening up. There's some in Oklahoma where there's no insurance taken. There are doctors that do surgical procedures that have a private membership association that are set up just like this. It infringes on nobody else. It doesn't take up any additional legislation. It doesn't make people go through hoops and ladders. The public is still protected under the current laws, but if you set up a private membership organization under your doctor's practice, then you don't have to answer once again to an association. Over time, association boards change, the leadership changes, the vision of that board changes, right? And that is exactly what I've seen over and over again. 25 years ago, I used to work with this association. We worked together to try to make exemption health freedom laws. They are now one of my biggest opponents because they were bought out, and I lobby against them every year. So that's how associations can be corrupted over time and change the vision, and not really corrupted, but associations change their vision over time of what those new board members want and what they're, and so when you cannot control where an association is going to take you. But as an individual doctor having a private membership organization that is just yours, then you get to be the creator of your own domain. And you can really give those member patients the care that you need. And as people see that this is truly free market and that bypasses government totally, that is freedom. Right now, we do not have freedom. We don't have freedom under associations, and we don't have freedom under licensing. But this is an avenue that would exempt doctors from that. So, so I'm just gonna kind of let that be. But
Thank you, Kim. We do have to move on. One thing, Byron.
Can I make
Wait 1 second. Wait 1 second, David. So I've had PMAs present here, and that is a great solution. It's like a private club. There are limits to it because you're private. You don't have the public access that you would like. It's certainly good. The exemption idea that Kim has, I think, is great. I'm not saying the mutual exclusivity, though. I think the certification competition idea is a great idea to help let licensing wither on the vine. So I don't see the either or problem here that some do. Byron, do you want to respond?
Yeah, look, I mean, if you have as many different associations as you have physicians, one of the advantages of licensing, and I'm not saying it's one that overwhelms the negatives of government licensing right now, is that it's shorthand information. Economists like to talk about perfect information in markets and all, but there's really no such thing. The fact is, I'm an advocate of transparency in government, and you can have so much transparency that bad things can hide in plain sight because of the overwhelming amount of information. Licensing is the one good thing it does is it provides shorthand information on behalf of practitioners to say, look, at least I have this amount of training. And it provides shorthand information to consumers so that they know, oh, he or she has at least had this much training. And that is preserved with the private certification proposal. Again, I don't see the mutual exclusivity here. And the issue here is that, you're misinterpreting if you think that, well, this somehow pulls everybody who practices in a particular space under this and subjects them to fraud law. No, only if they claim a certification that they don't have. In other words, this organization, its little medallion or certificate or whatever, and they falsify it. That's the only way they're going to be prosecuted under this proposal. This doesn't automatically all of a sudden umbrella everybody who's in a particular area. So that's just a misinterpretation of what the draft is about.
Dave, you have your hand up. Unmute yourself.
Yes, yeah, I think, you hear me?
I'm sorry, Dave Weiner. Dave, I'll come back to you, Dr. Weisbrot.
Thanks. This is a question about one of the slides in the presentation, and unfortunately I didn't write it down, so I don't know if I have the exact wording, but there was a slide which kind of described how this certification would work, and sort of one of the criteria I think was something like reasonable training requirements or something along those lines.
Rational certifying requirements.
Okay, rational certifying requirements. And, you know, when I first looked at that, I was like, great. But then I'm thinking about that some more and thinking, you know, that it's subjective and probably, you know, what you and I would consider rational, you know, the AMA might say is, you know, that somebody just doesn't have the training that they need because they don't want somebody competing who doesn't jump through the same hoops that that they do. So what do you think about that?
I think that's a valid issue. I think that what the draft is a little bit more specific than what I put on the slide, and that, you know, the requirements have to be rationally related to the scope of practice, that sort of thing. I don't remember right offhand. I don't have it right in front of me exactly how that's worded, but I think that's an area where there's some potential for, you know, rethinking exactly how the draft is stated. The main thing is that you don't want somebody saying, well, we're certifying brain surgeons and there's nothing in their certifying requirements having to do whatsoever with brain surgery, just as an example. And that'd be an extreme, but
Right.
And look, obviously that would be potentially differently interpreted from state to state, and that's one of the advantages of doing this on a state basis as far as the certifying law goes, is that you do still get that 50 state laboratory about how this would ultimately work with law enforcement officials and the courts helping to determine exactly how it would be enforced, and potentially ultimately the legislature being involved as well if it doesn't get enforced in a way that makes sense.
Thanks.
But
Dr.
I do,
go ahead, Bob.
I'm sorry. I do think it's something that would evolve. I don't think that you know, it's sort of like the way licensing has evolved to be more and more constricted. I think this would evolve in a way that would make it broader, because it's specifically designed to allow other certifying organizations to enter.
Indeed. Abigail, want to unmute yourself?
I appreciate the conversation and opening up this whole topic because it is very broad. People have mentioned the licensure, the different certifications, the maintenance of certifications. I would like to insert just a couple of things. One is that the underlying force behind all of these things, put it this way, I'm a Calvinist. I don't believe in pure altruism aside from ambition. We humans do have ambition and our own self-interests at heart, especially when it comes to adding the force of law. I've worked in opposing my state compact laws, the medical and the nursing, testified, written articles, and usually been the only one opposing with the nursing one. The question I have on that score, maybe someone can answer here. What happened to good old fashioned reciprocity as far as the state line issue and being able to travel? And I mean, that's the simple way of not adding any force of law, but simply opening up markets. And the other thing is, every single licensure attempt that I've seen has been driven by the people within that field. It is not a matter of protecting the public. It is not a matter of opening up markets. It is always an attempt to limit the market, drive up prices, decrease the amount of money that an individual has to spend in advertising, just plain to capture the market. And I have to agree with Kim. It starts with something less forceful, like certification, and then it progresses to monopolized certification. So I would love to see the text, Byron. I have to apologize. I was distracted during your presentation. Could I have the text of your bill or your proposed, because the idea fascinates me. I love the idea of breaking up the market. And this, it seems to me, it sounds like a reasonable way to start. But again, when it's always the industry that drives government. Government is not the great evil here. It's ambition of the industry behind it, pushing it.
Oh, I completely agree with that. And that's why this is set up in a way for a certifying organization that gets the fraud protection. There's as much, it's as broad as possible for you to be able to enter as a certifying organization getting that fraud protection. That makes it relatively easy for other certifying organizations to enter in competition with you. Obviously, the hope is, and obviously it's a hope, that you would get the political critical mass of competing certifying organizations involved in this so that they counteract each other politically. We didn't have that in the late 1800s with the AMA. And they couldn't avail themselves of fraud laws. So nobody had a way of saying, look, AMA, you're all wet. You don't need this. In a lot of ways, no, they had some legitimate issues. We have people that are really trained, and people can go out and duplicate our seal of approval, and we don't have any real recourse. And that would have been a completely accurate statement. And the only thing that they were offering, though, that they were telling lawmakers was the only solution here is licensing, which was a falsehood. But you've worked with legislators. I've worked with legislators. You know how easy it is, frankly, to dupe them. And they were duped, and duped nationally. And they continue to be duped nationally. I was in Texas when they first offered a law to license geophysicists, for Pete's sake. And it eventually passed. But
yeah, it is completely ridiculous when licensors get the bit between their teeth, the things that they claim and the power that they hold in legislatures is just remarkable. I'd like to mention one of the license laws that I fought was midwifery in Michigan. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating to enter a regional moms group and see the active conversation of people questioning, okay, I'm this far along, I'm looking for a midwife, who do you use? What do they do? What do they not do? Who's the best? Who do you recommend? The most active vibrant conversation you can imagine at vetting caregivers. And to me, that's not going to happen at the flip of the switch when you turn off licensure, for instance. That's something that has to grow organically. And
Right.
so it happens. I mean, it happens. And law can shut it down, but law can't start it up.
That's true. And that's why I'm saying that that's why this is created as open and broadly as possible. And yes, I will. Did you write down my email? B Shlomock, BSCHLOMACH at protonmail.com.
Very good. Thank you.
Sure.
Dave,
So Byron,
Westbrook,
I
if-
would like to,
Kim,
if
if
I
you could
may.
please wait 1 second, and we have one time for one more
Oh, sure.
question. Dr. Westbrook, go ahead. Unmute yourself, Dave.
One comment I have, what Kim was saying, I don't think there's anything wrong with privileges. If you have ambulatory surgical centers, they do, certify people that they've had adequate training, that sort of thing. Beyond that, and that includes the Oklahoma Surgical Group, which is one group anyway, so they're pretty certain of what kind of quality they do. I don't think the idea of certification or qualifying doctors is a bad thing. I think it's a good thing because patients don't necessarily understand what they're getting themselves into. And I've got some examples I won't go into, but the fact is that it's the people involved. When I started practice 50 years ago, licensure was an easy thing. Investigation was rare. Now it's very common and it's political. So it's the people involved. The head of the Ohio State Medical Association is a former attorney general. So naturally, her focus is going to be to investigate people. And boy, she's doing a great job of that. So it's the people involved. It's the individuals you choose. The bigger the organization, of course, the more corruption is likely. And that's what I see is happening in the licensure and certification procedures. It could happen with a national certification. It depends on the people that you have serving you and how responsive they are to the people who are being certified.
Thank you, David. And we are up at our hour. So thanks everyone for joining. Next week, I have Peter McCullough, who everyone should know, unless you live under a rock, highest cited cardiologist in the country, who I guess isn't smart enough not to be censored and disrespected by the narrative purveyors. So you know how to join us at noon Eastern every Wednesday. I want to thank everyone. Byron, do you want to give a last word, how folks can reach you?
Yes, again, my email is bshlomock, BSCHLOMACH at protonmail.com. Look at the 1889institute.org website, which is still up under model bills. You can find this and that, as well as that paper, a win-win for consumers and professionals alike.
Thanks, Byron. Thanks, everyone.